You probably already know that my Corona group and I are playing a game to figure out how many hats I can knit in one long strip before the end of December, and how many techniques I can use to complete the hats. The overview of the challenge is in this initial video. Every hat is separated from the others in the strip by waste yarn, and we leave a long main yarn tail after completing each hat so that we can use it at the end of the whole project to gather off the crown and seam the edges of the work together. That saves us an extra end to weave in. If you forget it, it's not the end of the world, but it is a help. Today's hats will be finished just exactly as I showed you in the first video, and we will knit 2 hats using 3 slip stitch techniques. This kind of sparing use of slip stitch creates an attractive textural feature on the purl side. Usually the purl is used as the right side for this kind of design because of that. This sort of slip stitch changes gauge very little from stockinette, but this sort of all over dense pattern can change it quite a bit, usually making it narrower and sometimes longer, so you may have to refigure your gauge. Since I want to leave my hats in a long strip for now, I will cover details like this in one final wrap-up video. That way I can tell you what size this hat actually came out using the same number of stitches and rows as the other hats, and how to adjust it if you need it a different size. This hat incorporates 2 different slip stitch patterns. They are created in the same manner, but by selecting different needles. I'll show you. Because slip stitch tends to pull in, become narrower fabric, we really don't want to use either of the styles of hem that we have used so far. So instead, at 2 to 3 whole numbers, tighter than the main knitting, try knitting 8 plain rows and then reforming. I'm doing every 3rd stitch as a purl. It could be every other stitch. Between the smaller stitch size and creating ribbing, the lower edge should pull in to match the fabric quite nicely. If you want to adjust your stitch count so that the ribbing comes out perfectly, you might want to make it a multiple of 3 plus 2. For this project, that would mean working 71 needles for the ribbing, 71 stitches, reforming every 3rd one after knitting the 8 rows, and then increasing 1 stitch on one side to get to our 72 stitch count. I also did my ribbing 2 different ways. In this case, there is no cast on. I will finish it later with back stitch. This isn't my real bind off. I'm purposely using contrasting yarn so that you can see it better. But we come up through 1 stitch, a brand new stitch, back through the last stitch that we'd already stitched into, up through a new stitch, back through the previous stitch, and so on across. When laddering down for ribbing like this, we ladder down the first 7 stitches and stick our tool into the 8th one. And then you'll only have 7 bars to latch up. Turn up to the main stitch size for the garment, knit 1 row across at ordinary stockinette settings. And now we'll start in selecting for slip stitch. This is also sometimes known as skip stitch, and it is not known at all to the Corona manual, but I was able to extrapolate it from the fact that they do have knit in what I call Fair Isle, which is in fact a 2-color slip stitch. To get slip stitch, move to the pass position. That causes every single needle to slip. But if we select the needles that we want to knit and bring them all the way forward, the number 2 position in the 1-2 lever will cause those needles to knit. So the ones that are in normal working position slip, the ones that we select knit. With the carriage set up as described, and it's now on the right, I'm selecting every other needle across, and those needles will create stitches. The other needles will slip. There are two different patterns represented. The lower one is created by selecting the same needles 3 rows in a row, knitting across, then the alternate set of needles 3 rows in a row. The upper pattern was created still by selecting alternate needles, but changing which exact needles were selected every single row. This kind of fabric is very warm. It can almost seem as though a lining was knitted into it. For this hat, I knitted up through row 37, then changed back to stockinette to knit the remaining 5 rows. That is because slip stitch would create an extremely bulky crown when we gather it in. The second hat also has a ribbed brim, but I first cast on by chaining around the needle shanks. Remember, you need to keep that loose so that the machine can knit the first row through with no trouble. Again, knit 8 plain rows at a reduced stitch size, then ladder down 7 of the rows and latch up. And again, we are inserting our tool to begin latching up into the first true stitch, not into the cast on. 1 plain stockinette row, normal settings, main stitch size, then change to slip settings. That's pass and number 2. This time we want only narrow lines of slip stitch running up the hat. It can be any sort of pattern, but I'm going to just create narrow lines. We're going to leave 5 stitches in work, which means bringing them all the way forward, and 1 stitch in normal working position so it will get slipped. Knit across and then select again. You can see where the stitch slipped previously. So we want the next stitch over to be the one that slips. If on any occasion the edge stitch is scheduled to slip, as mine was, don't let that happen. Just go ahead and let it knit to make a neater edge. The trick to remember for this kind of pattern is always that more stitches or needles will be selected than are left to slip, because you can only have small numbers slip to create this sort of design. Knit across and select again. You may either get your slip stitches positioned by going by a graph and counting to begin the selection every row, or what I'm doing that I think is probably more foolproof is visually finding the stitches that slipped the previous row, then selecting the next needle over to be the slipped stitch. And that means it should be in normal working position. The ones we pull forward are the knitting stitches. The ones left behind slip. Either side of this fabric could be the right side. Usually with this fabric, the purl side is the right side. Finish the crowns and sew the edges of the work together for a center back seam as described in the initial video, making sure to orient the fabric so whichever is the right side, that's the one where the seam is least visible. That's it for slip stitch hats, but stay tuned. Soon I will have a lined lace hat for you.